The left-hand glove was lying on the seat as though it had been placed there by someone who intended to return for it. That was the first thing Watson noticed. Not the woman, not the bolted door, not the two constables standing outside on the platform with their breath rising in small white clouds into the November dark. It was the glove. Single, pale grey, laid neatly across the velvet cushion with its fingers pointing toward the window, as if gesturing at something beyond the glass. The right glove was nowhere to be seen. And yet, the woman's jewels, a pearl brooch at her collar, a thin gold chain at her wrist, remained perfectly in place, untouched, gleaming faintly in the light of the single carriage lamp that still burned above her. The woman herself, Mrs. Eleanor Alderton, as the constables would later confirm, was unconscious, reclined against the far corner of the private compartment, with her head tilted slightly to the right, and her expression carrying the particular stillness of deep, involuntary sleep. Her breathing was even. Her colour was not alarming. She was, in every visible way, unharmed. And yet the carriage door had been bolted from the inside, the window latches were drawn, and no one on Platform 9 at Victoria Station had seen anyone enter or leave the compartment since the train had pulled in from the Guildford line some 40 minutes ago. The air inside the carriage smelled of something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, or a light rose water, beneath which lay something else, something drier and more mineral. Coal dust, Watson thought at first. But it was not quite that. It was the particular smell of soot that has cooled, that has settled, that has been disturbed, and then left to settle again. He could not have said, in that moment, why the distinction seemed important. He simply noticed it, the way one notices an off note in an otherwise familiar melody. "Gas lamp," said the constable nearest the door, a broad, patient-faced man named Gregson, no relation to the inspector, though he shared something of the same stolid reliability. He gestured upward. "Been burning the whole time. Conductor says it was lit when they left Guildford. She must have lit it herself, or had it lit at departure." He paused. "Or someone else did." Watson didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the curtain. It was a heavy thing, burgundy velvet, standard for a first-class private compartment on this line, and it hung in the way that curtains hang in sealed, still rooms, with a kind of weighted permanence, as though it hadn't been disturbed in hours. But in the lower left corner, just above the brass curtain ring nearest the door, there was a fold. A specific fold, sharp and geometric, the kind that cloth makes when it is pressed against something angular and then released. It was not the fold of a curtain drawn carelessly aside. It was the fold of a curtain that had been caught, briefly, by something passing above it, and then allowed to fall back into place. Watson crouched slightly to look at it more carefully. Then he straightened, said nothing, and turned back to Mrs. Alderton. Victoria Station. At this hour, approaching 10:30 on a Thursday evening in November of 1895, was not the roaring, churning engine of commerce it became by day. The great arched roof, a cathedral of iron and glass that Londoners had by now entirely ceased to marvel at, held within it the hushed afterglow of the day's final services. A few porters moved between platforms with their trolleys, the squeak of iron wheels carrying through the cold air with a strange clarity. The gas lamps along the platform burned steadily, their halos softened by the particular quality of winter damp that settled into the station each evening like a familiar guest. Somewhere far down toward platform 3, a locomotive exhaled, a long, slow breath of steam that rolled between the carriages and dissolved into the dark. It was into this atmosphere that Sherlock Holmes arrived. He did not hurry. He never did, in Watson's experience, when arriving at a scene that had waited long enough to grow still. Hurry was for scenes still in motion. This one had settled, and Holmes moved through settled scenes the way a man moves through his own library, with a quiet, proprietary attention, already cataloguing, already comparing what he found to what he had expected to find. He stepped onto the platform, glanced once at the carriage from 20 feet away, and then looked, quite deliberately, in the opposite direction toward the signal box at the far end of the platform. Watson had seen him do this before. It was not inattention. It was the practiced habit of a man who wished to see a thing fresh, without the distortion of expectation. Then he turned and walked to the carriage door. "The bolt," he said, before he'd even looked inside. "Thrown from within," the constable confirmed. "Had to get the station master's key to the override mechanism. Interior bolt on these first-class compartments. They can be opened from outside with a specific key, but the key is kept in the station master's office, not carried by platform staff," Holmes said. He was examining the exterior of the door now, running one finger along the edge of the frame. "And the station master was called at what time?" "About 20 minutes after. The train arrived, sir. 9:43, thereabouts." Holmes looked at the gap between the door and the frame. He looked at the small brass ventilation grill set above the window. He looked at Watson, who was still standing inside the compartment beside Mrs. Alderton. "The curtain," Watson said. Holmes's eyes moved to it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, without entering the compartment, he looked upward, at the roof of the carriage, at the seam where the roof panels joined, at a small square outline barely visible against the dark, lacquered surface. A roof hatch, standard on certain older models of first-class private compartment, designed originally for emergency ventilation, and, in earlier decades, for the loading of luggage from above at certain provincial stations. Most had been sealed or removed during the modernization programs of the 1880s. This one had not. Holmes looked at it for exactly 4 seconds. Then he looked at Watson again. "Don't explain it yet," Watson said quietly. He had learned, over years of these evenings, when Holmes was composing, and when he was ready to speak. "I wasn't going to," Holmes said, and there was something in his tone that was not quite a smile. He stepped up into the compartment and crouched beside the single grey glove on the velvet seat. He did not touch it immediately. He observed it. This, Watson had come to understand, was its own kind of conversation. Holmes and an object, speaking to each other in a language made of weight and wear and displacement. The glove was, on first appearance, unremarkable. Ladies' grey kid leather, a moderate quality, the kind available from any of a dozen establishments between Oxford Street and Kensington. The seam along the fourth finger showed slight wear consistent with regular use. The interior, visible at the cuff, was clean. There was no monogram, no maker's stamp that Watson could see. And yet the glove had been placed, not dropped, not fallen, but placed, with a particularity of intention that was difficult to dismiss. Holmes leaned in slightly. "3 things," he said, in the low, almost reflective tone he used when he was thinking aloud, rather than lecturing. The leather at the palm is slightly stiffened, not from newness, but from a substance applied to the exterior and then dried. The index finger has been extended and refolded recently, as if something was pressed between the fingers and then removed. And the glove is cold, colder than the compartment air, colder than the seat. He paused. It was brought in from outside. Watson looked at Mrs. Alderton. And her right glove is not here. Holmes stood, which is interesting because everything else belonging to her is. He moved through the small compartment with his particular economy of motion, examining the window latches, the ventilation grill, the lamp bracket, the edge of the seat cushions where they met, the wall panelling. He did not touch the roof hatch. He looked at it from below, at the slight smear of grey along its inner edge, a mark no larger than a thumbprint, left by something passing across it in the dark. Outside, the platform had grown quieter. The porters had moved on. The locomotive, that had been breathing its slow steam down near platform 3, had fallen silent. The November air pressed against the carriage windows, and the gas lamp inside cast its warm, unsteady light across the unconscious woman and the watching men and the single grey glove that lay between them like a question waiting to be understood. Watson checked Mrs. Alderton's pulse again. Steady, regular, untroubled. Whatever had brought her to this state, it had been precise in its application, and, apparently, careful of her continued existence. "She will wake," Holmes said, not as reassurance, but as deduction. Probably by morning, possibly sooner. He was standing near the door now, looking back across the compartment. Someone went to considerable trouble to arrange this scene. The bolted door, the untouched jewels, the positioned glove, considerable trouble and considerable care. He was quiet for a moment. That care tells us something. That whoever did this did not want her dead, Watson said. That whoever did this wanted her found, Holmes said, precisely as she is, alive, unconscious, contained, and, apparently, unrobbed. He looked at the glove once more. The missing glove is not here, because it was never meant to be here. It is somewhere else, doing something else. It is the thing this scene is pointing away from. The constable in the doorway shifted his weight. The gas lamp flickered once, a brief, soft hesitation, and steadied again. Watson picked up his bag. Outside, the fog had thickened against the glass, turning the platform lamps into soft, diffuse moons. There was a smell of coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular metallic coolness of a station at night. Honest smells, working smells, the smells of a city that did not stop simply because the light did. "We'll want the station master's records," Holmes said, stepping back onto the platform. "Every departure from Guildford this evening, every stop, every scheduled maintenance halt, the timing of the Guildford service, the specific platform allocation here. And I want to know when this model of carriage last had its roof hatch inspected." The constable nodded, producing a notebook. "And," Holmes added, almost as an afterthought, in the way that his most important addenda always arrived, quietly, at the end, as though they were the least consequential things in the world. "I want to know the name Harcastle. Whether it appears in any document connected to this train, this station, or this woman." He paused. "However loosely connected." The constable wrote it down without apparent reaction. Watson, who had heard the name for the first time in that moment, filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept Holmes's unforeseen pivots, the moments when a deduction had already extended further than the evidence currently visible could account for. He had learned not to ask in these moments. The explanation would arrive in its own time, at its own unhurried pace, probably over a late supper or a pipe at Baker Street, with the fire going and the rain at the window. For now, Mrs. Alderton was being carefully transferred to a station waiting room, where a doctor had been summoned. The grey glove remained on the seat, not to be moved until Holmes said otherwise. The roof hatch, invisible again in the dark exterior of the carriage roof, waited in its own silence. And the November fog, patient as ever, settled a little thicker against platform 9, and the gas lamps held their quiet ground against it, and the night continued in its slow, unhurried way, the way that nights in London always continued, indifferent to mystery, indifferent to the careful arrangements of those who moved through them with intent. Watson followed Holmes out of the station and into the street, where a hansom was already waiting. Holmes had an instinct for cabs that bordered on the uncanny, and they folded themselves into its interior, and the horse moved forward, and the city closed around them, and somewhere behind them, on a seat in a private first-class compartment on platform 9 at Victoria Station, a single pale grey glove lay in the lamplight, its fingers pointing quietly toward the window, toward the dark, toward whatever it was that it had been left to indicate. The fire at Baker Street had been burning since early evening, and by the time Holmes and Watson returned, it had settled into that most companionable of states, no longer ambitious, no longer cracking and spitting with the energy of fresh coal, but glowing with a deep, sustained warmth that filled the sitting-room from the hearthrug outward, and made the rest of London feel, by comparison, very far away indeed. Watson hung his coat on the stand by the door, and felt, as he always felt upon returning to these rooms after an evening's peculiarity, a particular unwinding in his shoulders, a loosening, as though the muscles had been holding a question all night, and were only now permitted to set it down. The armchair nearest the fire received him gratefully. He pulled it slightly closer to the glow, extended his feet toward the fender, and listened to the sounds of the room settling around him. Outside, the fog had thickened further. It pressed against the bow window in soft, shifting layers, turning the street below into something half-imagined, the occasional cab, the distant footfall, the muted clang of a gate, somewhere along the Marylebone Road, all arriving through the glass as though from the bottom of a lake. London, at this hour, was not silent, precisely. It was muffled. The city continued its breathing, slow, nocturnal, unglamorous, but the fog wrapped it in gauze, and the effect, from the inside of a warm room, was not unpleasant. Holmes did not sit. This was not unusual. In the aftermath of a scene, particularly one that had presented him with the kind of structured ambiguity he found most nourishing, Holmes moved. He moved around the room the way a musician moves around a difficult passage, approaching it from one angle and then another, never quite settling. He had shed his coat and his gloves, and now stood at the mantelpiece with his back to the fire, looking at nothing in particular on the wall opposite, which was to say, looking at everything that had accumulated in his mind since platform 9. Watson reached for his journal. It was a habit so long established that it required no thought. The act of opening the notebook, of smoothing the page, of picking up the pen, was as automatic as breathing. He had filled perhaps a dozen of these volumes since the beginning of his association with Holmes, and they constituted, in aggregate, a kind of unofficial archive of the city's quieter dramas, its stranger corners, its human puzzles brought forward for examination, and returned, usually, to a kind of resolution. He wrote the date. He wrote Victoria Station, Platform 9, a private compartment bolted from within. Then he paused and looked up at Holmes, who was now at the chemistry table, not working, only standing beside it, with one hand resting on the edge in a posture Watson had come to associate with the early stages of a case. That particular stillness of a mind in rapid motion. "The curtain fold," Watson said. "Yes," Holmes said. He did not elaborate immediately, which meant he was still ordering it, still placing it in relation to the other pieces. Watson had learned patience in this regard. Pressing Holmes for a premature explanation was like shaking a developing photograph. You destroyed the precision in your impatience for the image. The kettle on the hob began its preliminary murmur, a sound that belonged entirely to this room, this hour, this specific ritual of late evening return. Watson rose and attended to it, a matter of moving the kettle slightly, locating the teapot, finding the caddy on the second shelf where Mrs. Hudson had placed it, with the reliable orderliness that kept the household functioning. These small domestic ceremonies had always seemed to him among the most undervalued pleasures of a settled life. The weight of the pot, the smell of the leaf, the soft percussion of water finding its temperature. He carried 2 cups to the table between the chairs, settled back into his own, and waited. Holmes came away from the chemistry table and took his chair opposite. He did not take the tea immediately. He picked up his pipe from the rack beside the chair, considered it, set it down again. Then he looked across the fire at Watson with the particular focus that meant the composition was complete. 3 observable facts about the glove, he said. First, the leather at the palm was stiffened by a substance applied externally and allowed to dry. Not a cleaning compound, not a dressing, but something more transient, a residue. I would want to examine it more carefully under better light, but the texture is consistent with a light adhesive, the kind used in bookbinding or in the sealing of certain document cases. He paused. Second, the index finger had been extended and refolded. This is not something a glove does through ordinary wear. Something had been slipped between the fingers, or retrieved from between them, within the last several hours. Another pause. Third, the glove was cold, not merely cool from the carriage temperature. Cold, as though it had been kept outside or in an unheated space for some time before being placed, Watson wrote. The fire shifted, a coal dropping lower in the grate with a soft, companionable sound. And the contradiction, Watson asked. Holmes looked at him. This, Watson thought, was one of the small satisfactions of long association, that he had learned to ask the right questions. The contradiction, Holmes said, is that the glove was placed with care, deliberately positioned, fingers extended toward the window, and yet it was cold, meaning it was placed recently, close to the time of our arrival, not hours before. Someone arranged that scene not long before the conductor discovered Mrs. Alderton, which means the arrangement was not part of the original act. It was an addition, a finishing detail. He picked up the tea now, finally, and held it. Someone returned to that compartment, or had access to it after the primary act, to add the glove. Watson set down his pen. But the door, was bolted from the inside. The door was bolted from the inside, Holmes agreed, in the tone of a man confirming a thing he finds enormously interesting. As was every latch on every window. He looked at the ceiling of the sitting room for a moment, in the direction of no particular star. The roof hatch, however, is not a door, and it does not latch from the inside. It seals from above. The fog moved against the window. The fire breathed. Somewhere below, a cab passed along Baker Street with a slow, contemplative clatter of hooves on wet stone, and then it was gone, and the silence came back in around its edges like water filling a shape. Watson thought about the roof hatch. He thought about what it meant, not the mechanism of it, not yet, but the implication. Someone above the carriage, in the cold and the dark, at a station stop somewhere between Guildford and Victoria. Someone patient and deliberate and unhurried enough to have descended into a first-class compartment through its ceiling, performed whatever they had come to perform, and ascended again, leaving the scene precisely as they wished it to appear. "Hardcastle," Watson said. Holmes looked at him. "You said the name on the platform, to the constable. You'd not mentioned it before." Holmes was quiet. For a moment, a considered quiet, not an evasive one. "Hardcastle," he said slowly, as though tasting the name, "came to my attention 3 weeks ago, in a context entirely unrelated to Mrs. Alderton or to any railway carriage. A solicitor, Chancery Lane, a man whose professional reputation is adequate, unremarkable, competent in the ordinary management of estates and inheritances and the dull but necessary machinery of property law." He paused. And yet his name appeared at the edge of something that was not dull at all. I did not pursue it at the time. There seemed nothing to pursue. Another pause. "There is now." He said nothing more on that subject. Watson understood. He wrote the name in his journal, Hardcastle, and underlined it once, lightly, and left space below it for whatever would come. On the mantelpiece, between the Persian slipper and a small brass clock that had never kept quite accurate time, but which Holmes kept for sentimental reasons, he had never explained, there was a letter. Watson had not noticed it when they came in. It was possible it had been there all evening. Mrs. Hudson had a habit of placing correspondence on the mantelpiece when it arrived after Holmes had gone out, to ensure it was seen upon his return. But something about it caught his attention now. The envelope was a deep ivory, slightly thicker than standard. The seal on the back, the seal, Watson realized with a small start of attention, was cracked. Not broken, not torn open, but cracked along one edge, as if it had been pressed, and then flexed, as if the wax had cooled imperfectly, or as if the letter had been subjected to some gentle but persistent pressure before it arrived. "Holmes," Watson said, "the letter on the mantelpiece." Holmes looked at it. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, but recognition. He rose, crossed to the mantelpiece, and picked up the letter without touching the seal. He held it toward the firelight, and looked at the wax. "When did this arrive?" "I don't know. I didn't see it when we left." Holmes turned it over. The front bore only an address, 221B Baker Street, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone unaccustomed to writing quickly, or perhaps unaccustomed to writing under ordinary circumstances. There was no return address. He set it back on the mantelpiece, precisely where it had been. "Not tonight," he said. Watson looked at him. "It has waited this long," Holmes said. "It will wait until morning, when we can examine it properly. He returned to his chair, and when Mrs. Alderton has had time to wake. This was, Watson knew, not in curiosity. It was discipline. Holmes understood, perhaps better than anyone, that the quality of attention one brings to a thing determines the quality of what one finds within it. To open a letter at midnight, tired, with the smell of the station still on one's coat, was to risk seeing only what one expected to see. To open it in the morning, with fresh eyes and a rested mind, was to stand a chance of seeing what was actually there. The fire settled lower. The fog held its position against the glass with the patient, uncommitted persistence of London weather. Watson drank his tea and looked at the cracked seal from across the room, a small half-moon of dark red wax, imperfect, interrupting the smooth ivory of the envelope, like a single wrong word in an otherwise carefully composed sentence. He wrote, "A letter, arrived this evening. Seal cracked, not by us. Handwriting deliberate, no sender. Holmes will not open it tonight. This is either wisdom or theatre, possibly both." He paused, then added, "The glove was cold. This is, I think, the most important thing I learned this evening, though I cannot yet say why." Holmes had closed his eyes. This did not mean he was sleeping. Watson had made this mistake in the early years of their association, quietly taking himself off to bed to avoid disturbing Holmes, only to find him awake and active again 20 minutes later. The closed eyes meant the mind had retreated inward, drawing the curtains, attending to its own processes without the distraction of the visible world. Watson finished his tea. He wrote a little more, the curtain fold, the roof hatch, the smell of cooled soot that had struck him in the carriage, and which he still couldn't fully articulate why it mattered. He wrote the name Harcastle again, at the bottom of the page, and drew a small box around it. A placeholder, a room reserved. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked. The fire's light had softened to a deep amber, casting long, gentle shadows across the room, across the chemical apparatus and the stacked papers and the violin that lay in its open case beside the window, unplayed this evening, its strings holding their tuning in the cold warmed air with a kind of dormant readiness. Watson stood, stretched, and said good night to Holmes, who did not respond, which was its own kind of response. At the door to his room, Watson paused and looked back. Holmes in his chair, in the firelight, in the fog-muffled quiet of Baker Street, past midnight. It was a scene Watson had witnessed so many times that it had acquired, over the years, a quality almost like landscape, a fixed thing, a reliable geography, the fire, the chair, the mind behind the closed eyes, moving through its invisible terrain with that particular unhurried precision that Watson had spent years attempting to describe, and never quite captured to his own satisfaction. On the mantelpiece, the cracked seal caught the firelight and held it, a small, dark, imperfect thing, waiting with no urgency at all for morning. Mrs. Eleanor Alderton received them in a drawing-room that smelled of cut flowers and wood smoke, in a Kensington townhouse that had the particular quality of a place maintained with great care on a budget that did not quite match its ambitions. The curtains were good, heavy silk, a deep teal, but they had been turned at the hem, the original edge having worn thin. The carpet was excellent, but slightly faded in the path between the door and the fireplace, where feet had traced the same route for many years. The flowers on the side table were fresh, carefully arranged, and came from a garden rather than a florist. These were not the details of poverty. They were the details of a household that understood value and attended to appearances with intelligence rather than extravagance. Watson noticed all of this in the way that a man notices the condition of a patient's rooms, not intrusively, but with a quiet, accumulating attention, because rooms tell the truth about people in ways that people, in their careful social presentations, sometimes do not. It was 10:30 in the morning. The night's fog had thinned to a pale, luminous haze, and the November light that came through the teal curtains was the colour of weak tea, gentle and diffuse, softening everything it touched. A fire had been laid in the grate and was burning cleanly, without the sullen smokiness that afflicted fires in houses where the chimneys were neglected. Someone in this household understood chimneys. Someone in this household, Watson thought, understood a great many practical things. Mrs. Alderton herself was seated in the chair nearest the fire, with a small wool blanket across her lap. Not because she was cold, the room was comfortably warm, but because someone had placed it there, and she had not thought to remove it. She was a woman of perhaps 45, with dark hair that carried at the temples the first quiet notations of grey. Her face was composed, carefully, deliberately composed, in the way that faces are when their owners have had time to prepare for a visit and have decided in advance precisely how much they intend to reveal. She was, Watson thought, a very intelligent woman doing a very competent impression of a woman who had simply had a frightening experience and was still recovering. "Mr. Holmes," she said, with a warmth that was genuine enough but measured, a warmth deployed at a specific volume. "Dr. Watson, please sit. Mrs. Carey will bring tea." They sat. Holmes took the chair across from her, closer to the fire than Watson would have chosen, and looked at Mrs. Alderton with the open, unhurried attention that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for rudeness, and people who did know him recognized as the highest form of respect he was capable of paying. "How are you feeling this morning?" Watson asked, because someone had to, and because it was also a genuine question. "Quite well, thank you," Mrs. Alderton said. "Tired. A little—" She paused, touching 2 fingers briefly to her temple, in a gesture so small it was almost invisible. "A little uncertain about things. My memory of yesterday evening is not complete." "When does it become incomplete?" Holmes asked, not unkindly, but directly. Mrs. Alderton looked at him. Something behind her eyes assessed him, quickly and carefully, and appeared to arrive at a decision about the appropriate level of candour. "Clapham Junction," she said. "I remember Clapham Junction. The train slowed. I remember looking out at the platform. There was a woman with an orange hat. I remember thinking it was a remarkable colour for November. And then I remember nothing, until I was in a room at the station with a doctor and 2 very earnest constables." She paused. "I did not feel unwell before Clapham. I did not feel anything, particularly before Clapham. It was simply an ordinary journey, and then it was not." "You are travelling from Guildford," Holmes said. "Yes, I have a sister in Guildford. I visit every few weeks." She said this steadily, without the slight over-emphasis that people use when a true thing also serves as useful cover for something else. It was, Watson thought, simply true. "Alone? I prefer to travel alone." A small, dry note in this, something that was almost, but not quite, humour. "I find that travelling companions require a great deal of management." Holmes's expression registered something that might, on another face, have been the beginning of a smile. "Your private compartment was reserved in advance?" "Several days in advance, yes. I prefer a private compartment on the evening service. The first-class carriages are," she considered, "adequate, but shared." "Who would have known you reserved that particular compartment on that particular service?" The question was careful. Mrs. Alderton received it carefully in turn. "The railway company, obviously. My sister, who saw me off at Guildford Station. My housekeeper here, Mrs. Carey. And," she paused, and in the pause there was something, a small hesitation that was not uncertainty about the fact, but about the wisdom of stating it. "And a man named Harcastle. He knew my travel arrangements, had mentioned them in correspondence." Holmes said nothing. Watson, who had his own journal open on his knee in the pretence of taking notes, wrote the name and drew the small box around it that he had drawn the night before. "Your solicitor?" Holmes said. "My late husband's solicitor," Mrs. Alderton said, with a precision that carried the full weight of the distinction. "He remains, for the moment, the administrator of certain documents relating to my husband's estate, a matter which has not yet been fully resolved." She looked at the fire. "It has been 3 years since my husband's death. It should not take 3 years." The tea arrived, carried by a small, efficient woman of 60, who moved through the room with the authority of someone who had run the household long enough to regard it as a shared responsibility rather than a paid commission. She set the tray with practised economy and withdrew, closing the door behind her with the soft, definitive click of a woman who understood that the conversation in this room was not for her ears, and was entirely comfortable with that. Watson poured. The rain, for it had begun to rain, softly, without commitment, in the way that November rain sometimes arrived, not as weather, but as atmosphere, made a gentle sound against the window. The fire answered it with its own small crackle, and the room held both sounds together in a balance that was, whatever else was true of the morning, deeply peaceful. "Mrs. Alderton," Watson said, handing her a cup, "did you notice anything unusual before you lost consciousness? Any smell, any sensation, any person on the train who struck you as—" "I've thought about that," she said, accepting the cup with both hands in the way of someone who finds warmth genuinely comforting rather than merely habitual. "I have thought about it a great deal since this morning. There was a smell, very faint, something," she paused, searching for the word, "herbal, like a dried flower, not quite lavender, sweeter than lavender. I noticed it and thought perhaps a previous passenger had left something in the compartment, a sachet, perhaps, or scented paper." She paused again. "I did not think about it for long." Holmes set down his cup. "Which side of the compartment were you seated on?" "The left, facing forward." "And the lamp, was it already lit when you boarded at Guildford?" "No, I lit it myself at Guildford Station. The platform was dark by the time we departed." "With your own matches, or the compartment's?" She blinked, very slightly. It was the first question that had genuinely surprised her. "The compartment's. There is a small box fitted beside the lamp bracket." Holmes nodded, as though this confirmed something that had already been confirmed, which, Watson suspected, it had. Then Holmes looked at Mrs. Alderton's hands. He did not make a performance of it. He simply looked in the open way he looked at everything, without concealment or apology. Her hands were resting around her teacup, both of them, which meant both gloves were removed, which meant Watson could see what Holmes was looking at. The right hand and the left hand were not quite symmetrical in their wear. This was not unusual. Most people are not ambidextrous, and the dominant hand carries its evidence accordingly. But it was not the wear of daily use that distinguished them. It was the slight, faint mark at the base of the right index finger, a small, pale line barely visible, the kind of mark left by a cord or a band worn regularly against the skin and recently removed. A ring, perhaps, but the wrong finger for a ring and the wrong kind of mark for jewellery. Holmes looked up from her hands to her face. Mrs. Alderton was watching him watch her, and the composed expression had not changed, but something behind it had tightened very slightly. Not with alarm, but with the recognition that she was in the presence of someone who saw things she had not intended to be seen. "The key," Holmes said, quietly, almost gently. Mrs. Alderton was still for a moment. The rain continued against the glass. The fire continued its low commentary. "I don't know what you mean," she said. It was, Watson thought, the first thing she had said that was not true. Holmes did not press it. He set down his cup, smoothed his jacket, and rose with the unhurried ease of a man who has obtained what he came for, and is content to leave the rest for another visit. "You have been extremely helpful, Mrs. Alderton. I hope you continue to rest. Dr. Watson will leave his card. Should you think of anything further?" Watson stood, produced a card, and placed it on the side table beside the flowers. Mrs. Alderton looked at Holmes as he moved toward the door, and there was, in her expression, something that Watson could only describe as a very careful hope. The hope of someone who wishes to be helped, and is not yet certain that being helped will not cost you more than being left alone. "Mr. Holmes," she said. He paused at the door. "The documents," she said. If something were to happen to them, if they were to be, she chose the word carefully, altered or withheld, I would lose the right to the estate. Everything my husband intended for me would pass instead to a distant cousin in Edinburgh, who has never shown the slightest interest in anything except the money. She paused. I mention this, not because I believe you have not already understood it, but because I want you to know that I understand it too. Holmes looked at her for a moment. "The documents are what this is about," he said. "Not a question." "The documents," Mrs. Alderton said, "are what everything has always been about." Holmes nodded once, turned, and left. Watson followed, pulling the door gently behind him. In the hallway, Mrs. Carey materialized from some efficient dimension of the house and produced their coats with the quiet authority of a woman who has managed comings and goings her entire adult life, and finds other people's mysteries less interesting than a well-run household. Outside, the rain was soft and grey and thorough. Baker Street was 40 minutes away by cab, and the city between here and there moved past the windows in its familiar register of wet brick and gaslight, and the patient commerce of a Thursday morning in November. Watson opened his journal to the page with Harcastle's name in the box. Beside it, he wrote, "A key, worn on a cord at the right index finger, now gone. She knows where it is. She is not ready to say." He looked out at the rain, and below that he wrote one more thing. "She is not lying to protect herself. She's lying to protect the documents. There is a difference, and Holmes knows it, and I think she knows that Holmes knows it. The cab moved through the city. The rain continued its gentle, uncommitted work. And somewhere in a Chancery Lane office, lined with oak panels and the weight of other people's careful arrangements, a man named Harcastle sat with his own knowledge of the evening's events, and, presumably, his own version of what it all meant. The carriage had been moved to a rail yard off the Vauxhall approach, a wide, flat expanse of track and gravel and rusting equipment that existed in that particular category of London geography which is everywhere and nowhere, visible from a dozen different roads, and yet never quite arrived at intentionally. It sat among 6 other retired or awaiting carriages in the grey Friday morning light, its dark lacquered sides beaded with overnight rain, its brass fittings dulled by the cold, its curtains still drawn on the platform side exactly as Holmes had left them. The rail yard smelled of iron and oil and wet gravel, and the particular acrid sweetness of coal smoke that had been deposited in layers over many years, and now belonged to the place as completely as its own geography. Somewhere across the yard, a man was working with a hammer on something that required patient rhythmic attention, each blow arriving at a steady interval, like a very slow clock. Rooks moved between the carriage roofs with their sideways intelligent walk. The sky above was the colour of old pewter, flat and even, a sky that had decided against drama and was keeping its word. Watson stood on the gravel beside the carriage and turned his coat collar up against the cold. Holmes was already on the roof. This had happened in the interval between Watson stepping down from the cab and paying the driver, a matter of perhaps 45 seconds. And when Watson turned around, Holmes was simply up there, having made use of the iron service ladder bolted to the rear of the carriage with the unhesitating confidence of a man who had identified it from 20 feet away and calculated the ascent before his feet touched the gravel. He was crouching near the centre of the roof now, coat dark against the pale sky, moving with the careful, weight-conscious balance of someone who respects the structural properties of Victorian railway carriage roofs, and has no intention of testing them beyond their tolerances. Watson found an angle from which he could see both the roof and Holmes's face. This was the most useful position to be in during a Holmes reconstruction, not beside him, which rarely afforded the proper perspective, but slightly away and below, where one could watch the sequence of attention as it moved. The roof hatch was approximately 2/3 of the way along the carriage, set between the 2 lamp ventilation outlets that protruded from the roof on either side. It was a square panel, perhaps 18 inches to a side, with a recessed iron handle on the outer surface, and a simple drop-bolt mechanism that could be engaged from above or below. The wood of the hatch panel was original, older than the rest of the carriage's recent maintenance, with a weathered, silvered quality that spoke of many seasons, and no particular recent attention. Holmes looked at the hatch for a long time without touching it. Then he looked at the roof surface around it. Watson, from his position on the gravel, could see the particular quality of Holmes's focus shift, the way it narrowed and deepened, the way the rest of the world appeared to become, temporarily, less real to him than the 18 square inches of tarred roofing felt he was examining. He produced a small magnifying lens from his coat pocket and held it over the surface near the hatch's forward edge. "Here," he said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Watson, or perhaps to himself. And here. He moved the lens along the edge of the hatch. Then he straightened, replaced the lens, and looked toward the front of the carriage, toward the direction the train would have been traveling. "The soot distribution," he said, raising his voice slightly so Watson could hear. "On an operating railway carriage, the soot deposits on the roof follow the direction of travel. The engine is forward, the smoke carries backward, the accumulation builds heaviest at the rear. This is consistent and predictable." He gestured along the carriage roof. "The distribution on this carriage follows exactly that pattern, except in one area." Watson waited. "Directly around the hatch," Holmes said. "Within a radius of approximately 8 inches in every direction, the soot pattern is disturbed. Not absent, disturbed, as though something passed through it. A body, moving with deliberate care, but moving none the less." He looked at the hatch handle. The handle itself has a smear of redistributed soot along its left edge, which is consistent with a right-handed grip applied from above, pulling upward, in the dark, by someone who has located the handle by touch, rather than sight. Watson wrote in his notebook, holding it against the side of the carriage to keep the pages steady in the light morning breeze. "So someone descended through the hatch." "Descended and ascended," Holmes said. "At minimum twice. Once to enter, once to leave." He paused. "Possibly 3 times, if the glove was placed on a second entry." He moved to the edge of the hatch and looked down through it, into the dim interior of the compartment below. The drop from the hatch to the compartment floor is approximately 6 feet. Manageable for someone of moderate height and reasonable fitness, using the seat backs as intermediate support. The reverse, ascending, requires more effort, but the seat backs and the doorframe provide sufficient purchase for a careful climber. He closed the hatch, stood, and looked toward the front of the carriage. Then he looked back toward the rear. Then he looked at the surrounding yard with the expression Watson had come to associate with the moment when the physical evidence aligned with the theoretical framework, and the two became, briefly, the same thing. "Come up," Holmes said. Watson looked at the iron service ladder on the rear of the carriage. He looked at his coat, his boots, his notebook, and his general disposition toward ladders on cold November mornings. Then he made his way to the ladder and climbed. The roof, from above, presented the city differently. The rail yard spread out in its grey geometry, the parallel lines of track, the ranked carriages, the distant signal box. Beyond the yard wall, the rooftops of South London extended in their irregular Victorian pattern, chimney stacks rising at intervals, smoke from morning fires rising in slow columns and bending very gently in the direction of the river. It was a view of the city available only to those who had reason to be on rooftops, which meant chimney sweeps, pigeon keepers, and, occasionally, those engaged in the reconstruction of crimes. The cold up here was a different cold than the cold below. It was open, unmediated, honest. Holmes was pointing at the rail yard entrance toward the main line. Guildford, service, southbound, runs via Clapham Junction, then Guildford, with a stop at Woking. Last night's service made an additional unscheduled halt. He produced a folded paper from his inside pocket and consulted it. At Leatherhead. 11 minutes. Signal failure ahead. The delay is recorded in the operating log. Watson looked at him. 11 minutes at Leatherhead, Holmes said, is sufficient. For a man who had established his access point in advance, who knew the carriage number, who had the route memorized and the hatch identified, 11 minutes is generous. He refolded the paper. He would have been waiting on the platform, or near it, possibly on the roof already, having boarded at an earlier stop. The darkness and the signal delay would have provided adequate cover. He looked at the hatch. He descended. He administered the sedative, the herbal compound Mrs. Alderton described, almost certainly dispersed from the compartment's own lamp when she struck the match. At Guildford, designed to take effect gradually over the first 40 minutes of travel. By Leatherhead, she was unconscious. He retrieved what he came for. He ascended. He resealed the hatch from above. He paused, and the carriage continued to Victoria, bolted from the inside, its passengers sleeping, its lamp burning, everything in perfect order. Watson thought about the match. The compartment's own matchbox, Mrs. Alderton had said. Holmes had asked, and the casualness of the asking had concealed the significance of the answer. The matchbox prepared in advance, the lamp, the vehicle, the scent, the mechanism. A man who had access to that compartment before Mrs. Alderton boarded at Guildford, or who had arranged for someone else to prepare it. But the glove, Watson said. She was already unconscious at Leatherhead. Why place the glove at Victoria? Holmes looked at him with an expression that was, in its way, appreciative. Because the glove is not about Mrs. Alderton. The glove is about what comes next. Watson turned this over. Below them, the man with the hammer continued his steady work. The rooks moved. The cold sat on the roof of the carriage with the comfortable permanence of something that had been there much longer than either of them. A signal, Watson said slowly, or a misdirection, or both. Holmes moved toward the service ladder. The glove points toward the window. The window faces, on that platform, from that position, the direction of Waterloo Bridge. More specifically, the direction of the embankment, and the streets that lead from it toward the Strand. He began his descent. Someone left the glove to point. Whether it points toward truth or away from it remains to be determined. Watson followed him down, more carefully than Holmes, with the deliberateness of a man who has reached an age at which ladders deserve full attention. On the gravel again, with the solid certainty of the ground underfoot, Watson looked back up at the carriage roof. The hatch was invisible from this angle, just another seam in the dark lacquered surface, unremarkable, unannounced, the kind of feature that 1,000 passengers had passed beneath without ever thinking to look up. "The ribbon," Watson said, remembering. "You mentioned a ribbon on the hatch lever, inside, from chapter—" He stopped himself. He was writing this, not living it. He cleared his throat. Inside the compartment, there was a ribbon tied around the interior lever. Holmes had begun walking toward the yard entrance. A pale yellow ribbon, tied in a simple knot, not a bow, the kind used to bind document cases or to mark correspondence. He did not slow his pace. Not decorative, functional. It was used to hold the lever in the open position from below, to ensure the hatch could be resealed from above without requiring the person on the roof to reach back down into the compartment. He paused at the yard gate. The person who descended was alone. They could not hold the hatch open and climb simultaneously. The ribbon solved the problem. Another pause. It is a small, practical, intelligent solution to a logistical problem, the kind of solution a careful person devises in advance. The ribbon. Watson thought of it. Pale yellow, document weight, the kind found in solicitors' offices throughout the city, where the binding of papers was a daily act of bureaucratic ritual, where the colour of the ribbon sometimes indicated the category of document it secured. He did not say this yet. He wrote it in his notebook, standing at the rail-yard gate, while Holmes found a cab with his inexplicable instinct, and he drew a small line connecting the word ribbon to the word Hardcastle, already boxed on the previous page. The cab arrived. The city received them again. Its noise and its wet cobble smell and its general, magnificent indifference to the small human dramas unfolding within it. Watson looked out at the Vauxhall streets, passing by, and thought about a man on a carriage roof in the dark at Leatherhead, patient and deliberate, waiting for the 11 minutes to be enough. He thought about Mrs. Alderton's right hand, the mark of the cord, the key that was no longer there. He thought about the letter on the mantelpiece with the cracked seal, which Holmes had opened that morning at 7 o'clock, read once without expression, folded and placed in his inside coat pocket without sharing its contents. He had not asked. He would not ask. Not yet. The cab moved north, toward the river, toward Baker Street, toward whatever the afternoon would bring, and the city moved around it with the steady, grey November patience of a place that has seen everything, and is not particularly hurrying. Chancery Lane in the afternoon carried the particular atmosphere of a street that has been important for so long that importance has become simply its resting state, unremarkable, assumed, as natural as the stone beneath the pavement. The law had lived here for centuries, in its various forms and reformations, and the buildings along the lane reflected this tenure in their solidity, their darkness, their complete indifference to architectural fashion. They did not try to impress. They simply endured, which, in legal circles, amounted to the same thing. The offices of Hardcastle and Finch, solicitors, occupied the upper 2 floors of a narrow building set between a bookbinder and a firm of parliamentary agents, whose sign had faded to near illegibility, suggesting either a very old sign or a very inactive parliament. The entrance was a dark green door, with a brass plate polished to the brightness of something that understood its function was to communicate reliability without ostentation. The brass plate had been polished so many times over so many years that the lettering had developed a slight softness at the edges, not worn away, but rounded, as though the name had been smoothed by decades of other people's careful attention. Holmes looked at the brass plate for a moment. Watson stood beside him on the step. "He will not deny," Holmes said quietly before they went in. "He will deflect. There is a difference, and it is worth attending to." Watson nodded. He had his notebook. He had his patience. These, in visits of this kind, were the most useful things he carried. The clerk who received them in the anteroom was a young man of perhaps 22, with the careful blankness of expression that legal offices cultivated in their junior staff, the way gardens cultivate particular varieties of hedge, shaped deliberately, maintained consistently, designed to reveal nothing of the interior. He took Holmes's card, read it, without visible reaction, and disappeared through a door of frosted glass with the smooth efficiency of someone who has been trained to make every action appear routine, regardless of its actual nature. They waited. The anteroom smelled of beeswax and old paper, and something faintly mineral, ink, Watson thought, or perhaps the particular smell of documents that have been handled many times by many careful hands. A clock on the wall maintained its steady account of the passing minutes. Outside, the lane continued its quiet, purposeful life. The frosted glass door opened. The clerk reappeared. "Mr. Harcastle will see you," he said, in the tone of a man confirming that the sun has risen, neither surprised nor particularly gratified. Harcastle's office was everything the building had promised. Dark oak panelling, a large desk of the same material, shelves of bound volumes arranged with the precision of a man who believes that disorder in documentation leads inevitably to disorder in affairs. The window behind the desk looked onto a narrow courtyard where a single plane tree, bare of leaves in November, stood with its pale mottled trunk in the grey light, patient and enduring. There was a fire in the grate, smaller than the room warranted, but burning well. Harcastle himself rose to greet them. He was a man of perhaps 55, lean, correctly dressed, with the kind of face that communicated professional competence without communicating much else. His hair was grey at the temples and dark elsewhere, maintained with the same careful attention as the brass plate on his door. His eyes were steady and pale and gave nothing away, which was, Watson suspected, a quality he had spent considerable professional effort in developing. He shook Holmes's hand with the firmness of a man who has been shaking hands for 30 years, and has long since resolved the question of how firmly to do it. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "and Dr. Watson, please sit." He indicated 2 chairs before his desk with a gesture that was welcoming in form and carefully neutral in substance. "I read of Mrs. Alderton's unfortunate experience this morning. A dreadful business. I am glad to hear she is recovering." "Are you?" Holmes said. It was not precisely a question. Harcastle sat behind his desk and folded his hands. The folded hands, Watson noted, were very still. The stillness of a man who had decided in advance to be still, not the stillness of a man who was naturally at ease. "I understand you are assisting the police in their inquiries," Harcastle said. "I am, of course, happy to cooperate in any way that is—" a small pause, almost imperceptible. "Appropriate." "Appropriate," Holmes repeated, in the tone of a man tasting a word and finding it indicative. "Yes, let us discuss what is appropriate." He settled back in his chair with the comfortable unhurriedness of someone who has nowhere else to be, and no interest in pretending otherwise. Mrs. Alderton's late husband, Mr. Gerald Alderton, died intestate, or very nearly so. His estate, valued at approximately £4,000 plus the Alderton property in Wiltshire, passed into the administration of his solicitor pending the resolution of a disputed clause in a secondary document, a letter of intent, I believe, rather than a formally executed will. Harcastle's expression did not change. "That is a reasonable summary of a complex situation," he said carefully. "The clause in question," Holmes continued, "specifies that Mrs. Alderton inherits in full if, and only if, certain conditions relating to the continuity of the Alderton name are not met by a competing claimant. A cousin, I believe. Edinburgh. A Mr. Douglas Alderton. I am not in a position to discuss the specific terms of—" "The letter of intent," Holmes said, without raising his voice or altering his pace, "was sealed by Mr. Gerald Alderton personally. The seal hasn't been opened in your presence, nor in the presence of any appointed witness, since his death 3 years ago. This is irregular. Standard procedure would have required its examination within 6 months of the testator's death." He looked at Harcastle, with the open, unhurried attention he had earlier directed at the glove and the curtain fold. "The letter has been in your custody throughout." The fire made a small sound. The plane tree in the courtyard stood in its patient way. The clock on the desk ticked. Hardcastle unfolded his hands and refolded them. It was a small movement, almost nothing. But Watson saw it and wrote a word in his notebook. Refolded. "There have been procedural complexities," Hardcastle said. "The matter of the competing claim introduced certain delays that required—" "Mr. Hardcastle," Holmes said, "I am not here to discuss procedure. I am here because a woman was rendered unconscious on a railway carriage through the deliberate introduction of a sedative compound into a lamp she lit with a match from a matchbox that had been prepared for her in advance. Someone who knew her travel arrangements, knew her carriage number, knew the route and its stops, and had access to the equipment and the technical knowledge to make use of a roof hatch in the dark, at a station, in 11 minutes." He paused. "That is a considerable quantity of specific knowledge for a single person to possess. It suggests either direct involvement or the employment of a very well-briefed intermediary." Hardcastle was quiet for a moment that was slightly longer than a comfortable moment. "I hope you are not suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything," Holmes said. "I am describing. The distinction, as I am sure you appreciate in your professional capacity, is significant." Watson looked at the shelves behind Hardcastle. Bound volumes, legal references, document cases, the standard furniture of a solicitor's working life. But on the third shelf from the bottom, in the left-hand section, there was a gap. Not a large gap. Perhaps 2 inches. The kind of space left when a document case has been removed and not yet replaced. The dust pattern on the shelf was marginally lighter in that space than on either side of it, suggesting the case had been there recently, and had been recently removed. Holmes was looking at the same shelf. "The ledger," Watson said quietly, because the word had been in the back of his mind since the previous evening, since Holmes had first mentioned it obliquely in connection with this case, and because the gap on the shelf had now given it a location. Hardcastle's eyes moved to Watson. It was the first time he had looked at Watson with anything other than the polite acknowledgement of a man enduring the presence of a colleague. This look was sharper, more considered. "The estate ledger," Holmes said, looking back from the shelf to Hardcastle's face. "The document that records the administrative history of the Alderton estate since Gerald Alderton's death. Every decision, every delay, every correspondence, including, one assumes, any correspondence with Douglas Alderton regarding the competing claim." He let the sentence settle. "It was on that shelf this morning. It is not there now." Hardcastle looked at the shelf. He looked at it with the expression of a man who has been caught in something he believed was undetectable, and is now recalibrating at speed. To his credit, if credit was the appropriate word, the recalibration was rapid and professionally executed. "The ledger is in use," he said. "A clerk has it for reference, a routine matter." "Of course," Holmes said. He rose, unhurried, and buttoned his coat. Watson followed his lead. "I wonder if you might ask the clerk to ensure it is available for examination by, shall we say, Monday morning. There will be a representative of the court who will wish to review it." He said this in the mild, conversational tone of a man making a social arrangement. The court has a particular interest in document cases of this kind, those in which the original sealed letter of the testator has been held unopened beyond the statutory period. Hardcastle stood. His hands were on the desk. Mr. Holmes, if you are implying that any document in my custody has been in any way— I am implying nothing, Holmes said pleasantly. Good afternoon, Mr. Hardcastle. They were on the landing before Hardcastle's door had fully closed, and on the street before either of them spoke. The cold received them, and the lane moved around them with its afternoon purpose. Clerks with papers, a barrister in gown and wig passing at a dignified trot, a stationer's boy on a bicycle, demonstrating an optimistic relationship with the available space. Watson turned his collar up and looked at Holmes. He knew, Watson said. He knew before we arrived that we would come, Holmes said. He removed the ledger this morning, which means he received some indication last night that the investigation had moved in a direction that made the ledger a liability. He walked in the direction of Fleet Street. He is not the man on the roof. He is not capable, physically or temperamentally, of ascending and descending a railway carriage in the dark. But he is the man who knew the travel arrangements, the man who made certain telephone communications, the man who holds a sealed letter that he has no intention of opening if he can possibly avoid it. Because the letter favours Mrs. Alderton. Because the letter favours Mrs. Alderton, Holmes confirmed. And because Douglas Alderton in Edinburgh has been paying Hardcastle to delay its opening until the competing clause could be established in documentation that predates the letter's contents. A circular strategy, elegant in its way. He paused at the corner of Fleet Street. Not elegant enough. Watson thought of the ledger, its gap on the shelf, its recent removal, the dust-pattern lighter in its absence. He thought of the sealed letter with the cracked wax on the mantelpiece at Baker Street, which Holmes had read on Friday morning and placed in his inside coat pocket. He thought of Mrs. Alderton's hands around her teacup, and the pale cord mark on her right index finger where a key had hung. The key opens the lockbox, Watson said. And the lockbox contains a copy, Holmes said. Gerald Alderton was a careful man. Careful men make copies. He stepped off the pavement to hail a cab. The original is in Hardcastle's possession, sealed, increasingly inconvenient. The copy is wherever Mrs. Alderton kept it. Wherever she kept it, before someone removed it from her person on a railway carriage between Leatherhead and Victoria. He paused. Except that she was carrying the key, not the document, which means the document is still in the lockbox, and the lockbox is— He stopped. He looked at Watson. He almost smiled. Somewhere she felt it would be safe, Watson said. Somewhere, Holmes agreed, settling into the cab as it drew up. That is not her Kensington townhouse, which someone has already searched. Note the slightly displaced hall rug when we arrived, and the faint mark on the study windowsill where the lower sash was raised and lowered from the outside. He folded his hands. She is cleverer than Hardcastle anticipated. Most people are. The cab moved into the afternoon traffic. Watson opened his notebook to the page where the ledger was mentioned, where Hardcastle's name sat in its box, where the ribbon had been traced with a light line toward the solicitor's office, and the shelf with the 2-inch gap. He wrote, "The copy exists. The key is gone, but the box remains. The box is elsewhere." She knew. Below that, after a moment, he wrote, "She protected it better than they expected. This is why she is alive." The pawnbroker's shop near Waterloo Bridge occupied the ground floor of a building that had been leaning very slightly to the left for so long that the lean had ceased to be a structural concern and had become simply a characteristic. The way certain elderly gentlemen develop a permanent tilt that their acquaintances stop noticing after the first decade. The sign above the door read Emmett and Sons, Pledges and Purchases, though there had been no sons, apparent for at least a generation, and the Emmett currently in residence was a man of 70, who had inherited the business from his father and the lien from the building, and appeared entirely content with both. Holmes had known about the glove since Saturday morning. Watson understood this only when they were standing on the pavement outside Emmett and Sons, the November light flat and pale above the river, and Holmes said, in the conversational tone he reserved for things he considered obvious, that the glove had been left here sometime between 11 o'clock Thursday evening and 8 o'clock Friday morning. Placed on the counter by a man who said nothing beyond that it had been found on a train, and he wished nothing for it, only that it be kept. "How do you know all of that?" Watson asked. "Because I came here Friday morning," Holmes said, "while you were finishing your breakfast." Watson absorbed this with the patience of long practice. "And you said nothing?" I said, "Nothing because the glove alone was insufficient. The glove required the key, and the key required Hardcastle, and Hardcastle required the ledger, and the ledger required Mrs. Alderton to trust us enough to tell us where the lockbox was kept." He pushed open the door of the shop. "She told us yesterday evening. You were there." Watson thought back to the previous evening. A second visit to the Kensington townhouse, shorter than the first, conducted over a single cup of tea in a room where the fire had burned lower, and Mrs. Alderton had been, if possible, more composed than before. She had said very little. She had looked at Holmes for a long time after he finished speaking, and then she had said, quietly, the name of a place. St. Bridget's Reading Room and Ladies' Lending Library, Lambeth. It hadn't sounded, in the moment, like the location of a document that determined the inheritance of a Wiltshire estate. It had sounded like exactly what it was. A small, respectable institution serving the women of a South London parish, the kind of place that maintained its own quiet dignity entirely independent of whether the rest of the world was paying attention. Which was, Watson now understood, precisely why she had chosen it. But first, the glove. Emmett's shop interior was what pawnbrokers' interiors had always been, and would presumably always continue to be. A dense, horizontal archaeology of other people's necessities and other people's embarrassments, arranged on shelves and in cases with the egalitarian democracy of a place that assigns no moral weight to the circumstance of pledging. A violin, missing 2 strings, hung beside a good topcoat. A set of silver teaspoons in a velvet case sat next to a tin trumpet that had seen better decades. A glass case near the counter held watches, rings, a small pair of opera glasses, and, in the far left corner, on a folded square of brown paper, a single pale grey lady's glove. Emmett himself was behind the counter, a small man of the described vintage, with spectacles that magnified his eyes to an owlish size and hands that moved across the counter surface with the habitual restlessness of someone who had spent a lifetime handling other people's objects. He recognized Holmes with the comfortable familiarity of a man who has been visited twice in 3 days and has made his peace with it. "The gentleman again," he said, without particular surprise. "And a friend." "Dr. Watson," Holmes confirmed. "The glove, please, Mr. Emmett." Emmett produced the glove from the case with the practised care of a man who understands that everything in his keeping is, technically, someone else's. He set it on the counter on its square of brown paper. Watson looked at it in the daylight, proper daylight, overcast, but honest, for the first time. It was, as Holmes had described in the carriage on Thursday evening, a lady's grey kid glove of moderate quality, the seam-wear at the fourth finger, the extended and refolded index, the stiffened leather at the palm, all present, all exactly as noted. But Watson hadn't seen, in the poor light of the carriage lamp, what was visible now. Inside the cuff, folded in, pressed flat, so that it lay against the inner wrist of whoever wore the glove, was a narrow strip of paper. Not a note, not correspondence. A strip approximately 3 inches long and half an inch wide, with a number written on it in pencil, in a hand that was careful and small and had pressed quite hard into the paper. A number, and below it, 2 words, St. Bridget's. Holmes looked at Watson. Watson looked at Holmes. "She put it there herself," Watson said. "Before she boarded at Guildford," Holmes said. "She knew, or suspected, that someone would attempt to access the lockbox. She knew her key was the vulnerability. She also knew that if she carried the key on her person in the usual way and was incapacitated, the key would be taken and the box found." He picked up the glove by its cuff, carefully. So she arranged an alternative. The key on the cord at her finger was a decoy, a convincing one, because it was real. It opened something, but not the lockbox. Something smaller, something with nothing of value inside. Watson stared at him. She sacrificed the key deliberately. She sacrificed a key. The key to the lockbox was already elsewhere. Holmes set the glove down again. The strip of paper with the box number and the library name was in the glove. The glove was taken from her, but the person who took it was looking for the key, not for what was inside the cuff. They removed the right glove, found the cord key at the finger, took it, and left. He paused. They left the left glove behind because they had no use for it. They placed it, or arranged for it to be placed, at a pawnbroker's near Waterloo to suggest the work of a petty thief who had panicked and abandoned part of the hall. To misdirect the investigation toward theft, Watson said, which would have explained the missing glove, explained Mrs. Alderton's condition as an unfortunate side effect of a robbery gone further than intended, and drawn attention entirely away from the document motive. Holmes folded the brown paper around the glove. The plan was good, the execution was good, but Mrs. Alderton was better. Watson thought of her, composed in her chair, the wool blanket across her lap, the warmth of the fire, and the careful, measured warmth of her manner. He thought of the pale mark on her right index finger where the decoy key had hung, and the absolute stillness with which she had said, "I don't know what you mean," when Holmes had said the word key. She had been protecting the paper in the left glove. She had been protecting it since she woke in the station waiting room. Through 2 constable interviews and a doctor's examination and a sleepless night and their first visit. And she had protected it successfully until she decided finally that Holmes was the kind of man worth trusting with it. They thanked Emmett, who received their thanks with the philosophical equanimity of a man to whom gratitude is less common than desperation, and therefore more interesting. They stepped back onto the Waterloo pavement with the grey river visible at the end of the street, moving in its slow, tidal way under the November sky. "The library," Watson said. "The library," Holmes confirmed. "St. Bridget's Reading Room and Ladies' Lending Library was a 20-minute walk across the bridge and into Lambeth, a part of the city that the directories described as working-class residential, and that people who actually lived there described, when they described it at all, simply as home. The streets were narrower than Kensington, the buildings more compressed, the children more visible, and the window boxes more determinedly cheerful, as though the inhabitants had decided collectively that colour was not a luxury but a necessity, and had planted accordingly. The library itself occupied the ground floor of a converted terraced house on a quiet street, announced by a painted wooden sign and 2 window boxes that had been put to bed for winter, but showed, in their neatly turned earth, evidence of careful tending. The door was unlocked. A bell above it announced their arrival with a small, bright note. Inside was the particular hush of a room dedicated to reading, a specific silence, different from the silence of empty rooms, being a silence actively maintained by the presence of people engaged with the written word. 3 women sat at the central table with books or periodicals. A 4th was returning volumes to the shelves along the left wall with the quiet efficiency of someone who takes the arrangement of books seriously. Behind a small wooden counter at the far end of the room, a woman of perhaps 35, with red hair, and the look of someone who has run this institution largely by herself for some years, looked up at Holmes and Watson with the direct, unembellished assessment of a woman who is accustomed to deciding quickly whether a new arrival is welcome. Holmes produced Mrs. Alderton's note. He said nothing, simply laid it on the counter. The librarian, she introduced herself, after a moment's consideration, as Miss Carew, looked at the note, looked at Holmes, looked at Watson with the slightly more charitable assessment she appeared to extend to doctors, and made a decision. "This way," she said. She led them through a door behind the counter into a small back room that served as a combination store, workroom, and, it now became clear, repository. Along one wall were the lending library's reserve volumes. Along another wall, beneath a window that looked onto a narrow yard where a cat sat on a wall with the philosophical stillness of its kind, was a row of small lockboxes. 12 in total, numbered in brass, the kind found in railway station left luggage, offices and certain subscription reading rooms where members could store personal items between visits. Box number 7. Holmes looked at the strip of paper from inside the glove. He looked at box 7. He looked at Miss Carew. "Mrs. Alderton is a member," Miss Carew said. "Has been for 4 years. She keeps certain personal items here." She paused. "She sent a message this morning. She said someone might come." "She said someone might come," Watson repeated. "She said," Miss Carew appeared to be recalling the exact words with some care, "that a Mr. Holmes would come, and that if he produced the correct paper he should be given every assistance, and that if anyone else came, anyone at all, the box should be considered empty." Holmes looked at the box. Watson felt something that was not quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. A quiet admiration for a woman who had arranged all of this in advance, who had thought 3 moves ahead while unconscious on a railway carriage, who had trusted exactly the right person with exactly the right amount of information at exactly the right moment. Miss Carew produced a key from her cardigan pocket. The key to the box was kept, it turned out, not with the member, but with the library, a deliberate additional security that Mrs. Alderton had presumably arranged when she established the account. The box opened with the small, definitive sound of a well-maintained lock. Inside, resting on a folded square of blue cloth, was a document, a single folded sheet of good paper, approximately the weight and quality of legal correspondence. At its centre, intact and unbroken, was a wax seal, pressed with a signet ring, the wax a deep blue, bearing the impression of a small heraldic device that Watson could not identify, but that clearly belonged to the personal seal of Gerald Alderton. Holmes looked at it for a long moment. He did not touch the seal. "The copy," Watson said softly. "The copy," Holmes confirmed, "which, unlike the original in Harcastle's keeping, has been held in conditions that make its authenticity verifiable, 4 years in a temperature-stable room, by a credible third party, with a record of deposit." He closed the box gently, without removing the document. Mrs. Alderton did not bring this here in anticipation of Thursday's events. She brought it here 4 years ago, shortly after her husband's death, because she already understood that Harcastle couldn't be trusted with the only copy. He looked at Miss Carew. "We will need this transferred to a solicitor of Mrs. Alderton's choosing, formally with witnesses, and with a written record from you regarding the conditions and dates of its keeping." Miss Carew nodded, as though this was the kind of request she received regularly, which Watson suspected it was not, but which she was handling with impressive steadiness. "I will prepare whatever documentation is needed," she said. They left the library as the afternoon light began its early November retreat, pulling colour from the streets and leaving behind the blue-grey dusk that settled on Lambeth like a familiar blanket. The cat on the yard wall had not moved. The window boxes stood in their patient wintered rows. Watson walked beside Holmes in the direction of the bridge. The river came into view at the end of the street, wide, dark, moving steadily in the way that the Thames always moved, with the indifferent authority of something that has been passing through this city since before the city existed, and will be passing through long after. She knew all along, Watson said, from the beginning. She knew what they were after, why they were after it, and she had already protected it. "She knew for 4 years, Holmes said. "She has been waiting for them to move, knowing that when they did, the move itself would provide the evidence that the document alone could not." He paused on the bridge, looking down at the water. "She is, in the precise sense of the word, a strategist." Watson thought about the glove, the careful strip of paper inside the cuff, the decoy key on the cord, the library in Lambeth with its 12 boxes and its competent librarian and its window boxes turned over for winter. He opened his notebook, standing on the bridge with the Thames moving below and the city lights beginning their evening emergence on both banks, and he wrote, "She arranged her own rescue before she needed rescuing." The glove was not the clue. The glove was the message, and it arrived exactly where she intended. Below that, after a long moment looking at the water, he added, "The key Harcastle's man took opens a small tin box in her Kensington study. Inside the box, nothing. She left it empty on purpose. I find this, more than anything else in this case, entirely admirable. Sunday arrived in London the way it always did in November, quietly and with a certain authority, as though the city had agreed, by long collective habit, to breathe at a slightly slower rate for the day. The traffic on Baker Street was reduced to the occasional cab, and the more occasional pedestrian, the latter moving with the unhurried gait of people who had nowhere they were required to be before noon, and were finding this agreeable. The church bells had rung at 8, and would ring again at 11, and between these two events the morning held itself in a pleasant suspension, not quite the working week, not quite leisure, but the particular Sunday quality that is both simultaneously in the best possible combination. The fire in the sitting-room at 221B had been lit since 7. By 9:30 it had achieved its finest state, deep, steady, generous, the coals arranged by some fortunate accident of their settling into the configuration that produces the most even warmth with the least drama. The room smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the faint, pleasant ghost of last night's pipe. Rain had begun sometime in the early hours, and was continuing in the mild, unhurried way of rain that has no particular schedule. Not heavy enough to be unpleasant, not light enough to be ignorable, simply present, doing its work against the windows with a soft, rhythmic patience. Watson was in his chair with his journal open on his knee. Holmes was at the window, not looking out so much as standing in the vicinity of the view, while his attention was elsewhere, directed inward, running over the architecture of the past 4 days the way a man runs his hand along a completed piece of work, checking for imperfections, finding, on the whole, that there are none. On the mantelpiece, the ivory envelope was gone. In its place, the small brass key that had been retrieved from a lockbox in Lambeth now sat beside the Persian slipper, returned by Mrs. Alderton that morning via a note delivered by Mrs. Carey, with the simple instruction that Holmes might keep it as a record of the matter, or dispose of it as he saw fit. Beside the key, the pale yellow ribbon from the roof hatch lay in a loose coil. Beside that, folded once, was a single page from the estate ledger, a copy made by Holmes on Saturday afternoon after a court representative had obtained access to Harcastle's offices under the authority of a document Watson had watched Holmes compose on Friday evening, with a speed and specificity that suggested he had been composing it in his head since Thursday night. The ledger page recorded, in Harcastle's own careful hand, 17 separate administrative delays applied to the Alderton estate over 3 years. Each delay had a noted reason. None of the reasons, examined individually, appeared improper. Examined together, in sequence, with the correspondence from Douglas Alderton filed alongside them, they formed a pattern as clear and deliberate as the soot marks on a carriage roof. Harcastle had not been arrested. This was, Watson knew, the part of Holmes's resolutions that required the most adjustment, for those accustomed to more dramatic conclusions. The law moved at its own pace, through its own channels, and Holmes's role, as he had explained more than once, with varying degrees of patience, was to arrange the evidence into the precise configuration that made those channels flow in the correct direction. What happened within them afterward was the law's business, not his. What had happened, in practical terms, was this. Harcastle had been visited on Saturday morning by a representative of the court and a senior partner from a firm of Holborn solicitors who had no connection to the Alderton estate, and therefore every quality of disinterested authority. The ledger had been examined. The sealed letter, Gerald Alderton's original, intact, its blue wax unbroken, despite 3 years of Harcastle's careful stewardship, had been formally identified, witnessed, and transferred to the court's keeping pending its opening at a properly convened hearing. Douglas Alderton. Edinburgh had been notified by telegram that the competing claim documentation he had submitted through Harcastle's office contained certain inconsistencies that would require his personal attendance at a hearing in London. He had not yet replied, which Watson took to be the reply of a man consulting his own solicitor at considerable speed. Harcastle himself had made no further contact. His office had been, according to the clerk who answered the telephone on Saturday afternoon, engaged with internal matters. The man on the carriage roof remained, in official terms, unidentified. Holmes knew who he was. Watson was certain of this, in the way he was always certain of the things Holmes knew and had not yet shared. But the formal identification was a matter for the police, who were pursuing their own lines of inquiry with the dogged thoroughness of institutions that prefer to arrive at conclusions by their own route, however indirect. "The ribbon," Watson said, looking up from his journal. Holmes turned from the window. "You said it was document weight, the colour used in solicitors' offices for a specific category of correspondence." Watson looked at the coil of pale yellow on the mantelpiece. "Which category?" "Inheritance matters," Holmes said. "Specifically, documents pending resolution. The colour coding is not universal. It varies between firms. But in Harcastle's office, as I confirmed on Friday from an examination of the correspondence files the court representative accessed, pale yellow indicates documents in the active pending category." He paused. "The ribbon on the hatch was from Harcastle's office. The man on the roof was provided with it, given it along with whatever other materials and instructions he required, by someone who works within, or has direct access to, that office." Watson wrote this down. Harcastle supplied his own evidence. "Harcastle was tidy," Holmes said. "Tidiness in a criminal enterprise is a consistent source of liability. People who tie ribbons around hatch levers are people who do not like loose ends, and the habits of neatness they bring to legitimate work they also bring to illegitimate work, with identical and ultimately traceable results." He came away from the window and took his chair. "It is one of the more reliable features of the careful criminal." Outside, the rain continued its Sunday work. The fire continued its steady, benevolent contribution to the morning. The brass key on the mantelpiece caught the firelight and held it, a small, bright point against the dark wood. Watson thought about Mrs. Alderton. He had thought about her frequently over the past 4 days, and his thoughts had the quality of thoughts about someone who has done something genuinely admirable, in circumstances where admirable behaviour was both necessary and costly. She had spent 3 years knowing that Harcastle was working against her, knowing that the document in her lockbox was her only real security, knowing that any direct challenge would result in delays and counterclaims and the slow erosion of a position that was already precarious. She had waited. She had maintained the Kensington townhouse, and visited her sister in Guildford, and arranged her key on its cord, and kept the library box paid and the ribbon in the glove, and she had waited for whoever was working against her to finally move, because she understood, as strategists understand, that a move made in the open is a move that can be countered. She had been rendered unconscious on a railway carriage, and had woken in a waiting room with 2 constables and a doctor and no left glove, and she had assessed the situation and decided that Sherlock Holmes was the appropriate next move. Watson found this still entirely admirable. A note had come from her that morning, with the key and the brief instruction about its disposal. At the bottom of the note, below Mrs. Carey's neat transcription of Mrs. Alderton's words, was a line in a different hand, Mrs. Alderton's own, slightly unsteady but clear. It read, "The carriage was a miscalculation on their part. I was never as undefended as I appeared." Holmes had read this, set it on the mantelpiece, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he had said, to the room in general, "Yes," in the tone of a man confirming a deduction he had made some time earlier. Watson wrote the line in his journal. Then he closed the journal, set it on the side table, and looked at the fire. The objects on the mantelpiece, the key, the ribbon, the ledger page, had already begun their transition from evidence to keepsake, which was the inevitable fate of the objects that passed through this sitting-room. In a week they would simply be part of the accumulated geography of 221B, filed in the category of resolved matters, available for reference but no longer urgent. The key would stay. The ribbon would likely be repurposed for something chemical. The ledger page would join the indexed files that occupied the bottom drawer of Holmes's desk. The carriage itself, Platform 9's private first-class compartment, the one with the repaired roof hatch and the burgundy curtain with its geometric fold, had been returned to service on Saturday. It was running the Guildford line again, carrying passengers who bolted the door from the inside for the ordinary reason of preferring privacy, and who looked out at the passing November landscape without knowing anything of what the compartment had held 4 days earlier in the November dark. It was, Watson thought, the nature of carriages. They moved on. The journey that had happened within them left no visible mark on the seats or the lamp brackets or the curtain rings. Only the people who'd been present carried the record forward. In their understanding, in their caution, in the quiet way that survived experiences shape the people who survive them. He picked up his pen again. He opened the journal to the final page of this account, smoothed it with his palm, and wrote the last entry. Sunday. Rain. Fire. The case is resolved, or as resolved as these matters become. Which is to say, the evidence is arranged, the documents are where they should be, and the people who arranged a woman's unconsciousness on a railway carriage are in the process of discovering what it costs to underestimate someone who has been preparing for exactly this for 3 years. Mrs. Alderton will have her estate. The hearing will be, I think, brief. The carriage is back on the Guildford line, the hatch is sealed, the glove is with the police. Holmes is in his chair. The fire is good. Somewhere across the city, in a Lambeth library with winter window boxes and 12 numbered lockboxes, Miss Carew is preparing whatever documentation is needed, because that is what she does, and she does it well. Outside the rain continues. London continues. The bells will ring at 11. That is enough.